Welcome, students of Paul. Today we're going to be talking about the ascetic reception of Paul. We have talked in previous video about the pastoral letters, which most scholars believe were written at least a half century after the undisputed letters of Paul and a half century after Paul's death. And the pastoral letters represent a way of taking the Pauline tradition and bringing it into the mainstream, into a movement that was accommodating itself to the Roman Empire and to a wider society, and that was beginning to realize that it was planning for the long term, that Jesus would not be back immediately in the Parousia. Well, on the other side from the pastorals, as was mentioned before, you have quite a different appropriation of Paul, which is the ascetic reception of Paul, which takes Paul's words about remaining chaste, about devoting oneself to prayer, about being unmarried, about women and men traveling together asexually, and about virgins, and all of this is part of the ascetic reception of Paul. And this is a very different way of the movement accommodating itself and taking over the tradition. And one of the best examples of this particular way of understanding Paul is the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla. And we're going to be taking a look at some of that. So the question is, what happens when a pivotal figure or movement, which is occasional, that is, happens in a specific time and place, speaks to a specific time and situation, survives that moment and becomes a long-term ongoing movement? So Paul did not plan for Jesus believers, the pagan Jesus believers that he spoke to in Ephesus or Corinth. He wasn't planning on those people having grandchildren. Because there would be no time. The world, as we know it, would have ended by that point. The Parousia would have happened. The God of Israel would have vindicated that God's self in history. Israel would be vindicated, and time as we know it would have come to an end. That didn't happen. And so how is Paul's movement then incorporated into what he could not have foreseen, what became the church? He would not have foreseen that it became Gentile only, primarily, and that the Jewish Jesus followers became first a minority and then even a heresy eventually in the early church, condemned. Paul would never have foreseen this, and he had very few ideas about structure in an ongoing way. So much of what became Christianity would have been mind-blowingly new to Paul. So what happens in a situation like that? In a situation where a movement takes on form and realizes it's going to be around for a while, questions naturally arise around leadership and structure, around membership, and around relations. And this is part of the reason why we even have a New Testament, because membership is either restricted or big umbrella, but also how do you form, how do you catechize, how do you teach new people coming into the faith? Well, you need scriptures. Also, what happens when the original witnesses to Jesus begin to die? Well, you have to write the scriptures. So it's not surprising that the Gospels and other scriptures start to be written right around the year 70 into 120. So this is around the time that the witnesses are dying, that people who actually were there or knew people who were there are passing away. Such questions are rarely asked consciously. Rather, a movement tends to go different directions and split into factions. This has been true of many, many different movements in sociological studies of Seventh-day Adventism, of Mormonism, of various Christian religious groups, other Christian religious groups, of Muslim groups, and so on, and of non-religious groups will confirm this, that there tends to be questions about leadership and structure, questions about membership, and questions about relationship. This is could be true of the Scouts. It can be true of a parent-teacher association. But it's certainly been true of just about every important religious movement ever. So the Acts of Paul and Thecla give a description of Paul. So the Acts of Paul and Thecla are on one side, the pastorals are on the other, roughly speaking. They go two different directions, quite different. Acts of Paul and Thecla are far more ascetic, and the pastorals are far more accommodating to Roman society and to the Roman household. This is a quote from the Acts of Paul and Thecla about Paul. Our only physical description of Paul. Is it accurate? Who knows? It comes from much, much later. For Titus had given them a description of Paul's personage, At length they saw a man coming, namely Paul, of a small stature, with meeting eyebrows, that is a unibrow, bald or shaved head, bow-legged, strongly built, hollow-eyed, with a large crooked nose. He was full of grace, for sometimes he appeared as a man, and sometimes he had the countenance of an angel. This is where we get this image of Paul with a hairline sort of like mine, balding, with a unibrow, big nose, and not at tall a man. Acts of Paul and Thecla here again is a reliquary of Thecla from the Middle Ages. So did Thecla look like this? Almost certainly not. A reliquary is where you kept, where people, the faithful, kept some memento of Thecla, whatever it might have been. And this is a reading from Paul and Thecla. I invite you to pause the video at any time and just read through some of it. But I want to point out the parts highlighted in yellow. Paul went, and according to this, the message, Paul's message, which sounds a lot like Jesus, by the way, on the Sermon on the Mount, but Paul's message, according to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, includes, blessed are those who keep their flesh undefiled. Blessed are they that abandon their secular enjoyments. Blessed are they who have wives as though they have them not. That's almost a quote from 1 Corinthians. Blessed are they who abandon all the glories of the world, for they shall judge angels. Blessed are the bodies and souls of virgins, who shall not lose the reward of their virginity. So Paul's message, according to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, was very much part of the ascetic message of abstinence and keeping oneself pure for the day of the Lord. Here's a different reliquary of Thecla. I happened to be in a place where I saw these in the British Museum, I think. The Acts of Paul and Thecla dates from the mid-2nd century, about the same time as First Clement, and within a decade or two of the pastoral letters. Widely known in many different languages, Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century knows it and condemns it. Thecla of Iconium was widely known and venerated, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. She was known as an apostle of Jesus. So it dates around the same time as the pastoral, slightly later. It reads much more interestingly because it's much like a Greek novel. It has and it's called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, but frankly, it's mostly about Thecla. And it's too bad that my picture is wiping out Thecla here. Thecla both preaches and baptizes. So what are some of the things that go on? Unlike the pastorals, where women are supposed to learn in silence, in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Thecla both preaches and baptizes, fully participates as a woman in the leadership functions of the church. She is celibate. In fact, the whole point of the novel is that she chooses celibacy, and the men to whom she is betrothed by her parents are so angry that they always want to murder her. So much of the action of the piece is Thecla fleeing from men who want to either rape her or murder her, and being protected by God in this. She is celibate and promotes celibacy. She loves Paul and adores Paul, but Paul actually plays a very minor role, and he's kind of, to be honest, he's not very helpful in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. He shows up every now and then after all the action has been done and doesn't seem to be able to do much for Thecla. In the text, Thecla is occasionally protected by the women of the city where she is, and later paintings of Thecla were sometimes defaced, as in this one, which you can't really see near Ephesus, likely by increasingly anti-women Christians against the independence of women in the movement. Thecla stands for independent women apostles, missionaries of Jesus. And as such, she came in for the memory of Thecla came in for a lot of hate in the Christian movement. Thecla, you can read this, pause this, and read it on your own. It's a full text from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And one of the interesting things for me about this is that this is Thecla's auto-baptism. That is, Thecla actually baptizes herself, which is quite unusual. And it's about the sea calves, and she's in the stadium, and they're about to tear her to pieces, but she is protected by a female lion, and then she throws herself in the water and baptizes herself. Read this, if you would, take some time and read this, and it gives you a good sense of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Here is another, and this is taken from the very end of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and if you would take some time and read it, it will give you an idea about the very end of Thecla's life according to the novel, where Thecla one more time is in danger from men who want to violate her and to control her, to have power over her. She is protected by God. She goes into a rock which instantly closes behind her and then protects her. And I wanted to point out at the very bottom that it says, thus suffered that first martyr and apostle of God. So very much considered by this text, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, as one of the apostles of God, the Virgin Thecla. And virgin is not an accidental word there. She kept herself pure, according to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and therefore ready for the kingdom of God. So again, the Acts of Paul and Thecla take the asceticism of the historical Paul, and 60, 70, 80 years later go one direction with it, whereas the pastorals ignore that asceticism and go a different direction with Paul. So Paul, some aspects of his writings can be considered more accommodating to wider Mediterranean Roman society and some more sectarian. And Paul had lots of interpreters after his death, the letter of Acts, the writer of the pastoral letters, the writer of Paul and Thecla, First Clement. And basically, I've divided it into three different ways that Paul's tradition was received. Ascetic reception, as we've been talking about in this video, the Paul and Thecla, anti-family, anti-marriage, anti-procreation. The broad proto-Catholic, like the pastoral kind of reception, pastoral letters and First Clements, which stress the importance of family and children, which again, if you think the day of the Lord is tomorrow, it's not that you're against family and children, you just don't think there will be time for it. Accommodation to wider Roman societal norms, pro-family, pro-marriage, pro-procreation. And then finally, I just want to note this in passing, that there was also the ongoing Jewish followers of Jesus stream. And these people were certainly the most important aspects of the early Jesus movement. They were the most important in Paul's own letters. And one of the historic ironies is that after the city's destruction at the hands of the Romans in the year 70, it seems that the Jewish Jesus-following people who were in charge of the first Jesus assemblies, in charge of the church for the first decades, are shunted aside by what becomes Christianity, a Gentile or non-Jewish religion, and ironically are even but they do survive for many, many centuries and are important for many centuries, but are sometimes condemned as a heresy by the others, which has got to be one of those, one of the most ironic and horrifically ironic things in a very ironic history of Christianity. The battle for Paul's influence and memory. So we see basically these two different kinds of responses: the sort of accommodate to the wider society and move into asceticism, fighting for control of the church. Some of the important texts: Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, the pastorals, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, Acts of Paul and Thecla, 1 Clement, and Marcion, who we're not going to talk much about here, but if you get a chance, Google Marcion, or if you already know something, take a look at one of the sources about Marcion. Marcion was later condemned as a heretic, and Marcion was certainly one of the most important early interpreters of Paul, in part because he tried to expunge Paul of any potential Jewish influence. Marcion was very set against the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, and as such tried to make Paul out into something that he was not. That is, Marcion was very important in sort of this idea that Paul turned his back entirely on his Jewish heritage, which the Paul within Judaism school, in which I believe he certainly did not. So trajectories to the post-history of Paul: the fracturing of a movement, Paul's uncontested letters. You have the apocalyptic and ascetic Pauline Christianity adopted in Paul and Thecla and elsewhere. You have the Deuterocanonicals and the pastorals, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, which then move into what becomes majority Christianity, the majority view of Paul. And then finally, you have Paul's Jewish Jesus following stream, which continues on with Jewish Christians repudiating Paul. These people, Paul was the anti-apostle, and eventually being identified as heretics. So Paul's tradition was taken up in many different ways: full-on rejection, and an acceptance of his ascetic streams, and an acceptance of his many parts of his theology, but accommodating it to the wider society. I'm going to leave this for you. This is around the year 150, so again, about a century after Paul. And Justin Martyr is one of the few Christian thinkers whose writings we have from that period of time. And he says some things about those who continue to observe the Torah in the 2nd century, and I'll leave that you to read that. And if you'd like more background on this, Who Made Early Christianity? The Jewish Lives of the Apostle Paul by John Gager is a good book. And I invite you to, it does exist in many libraries, and I invite you, if you have a chance, to take a look at that. It gives you some understanding of what happened to the tradition of Paul. So we can't understand Paul without understanding what became of Paul, the reception of Paul. And that continues through Augustine and Jerome, and into the Middle Ages with Luther and others, and into contemporary period with Heidegger and so many other, Moltmann and so many others, Bultmann. But it's important to say the historical Paul, that is the Paul of the Undisputed Letters, was an apocalyptic thinker who was also a mystic, and who believed that the world, and who was a Torah-abiding Jew of the first century. So an apocalyptic thinker, a mystic, and a Torah-abiding Jew of the first century, who was obsessed with non-Jews and their place in the coming eschaton, in the parousia, and in the vindication of Israel by the God of Israel. And what happens when the parousia doesn't happen and the movement continues on for 2,000 years is that all of these things, which are little things in Paul's writing, little moments in Paul's writing, become trends and movements in and of themselves. So I hope you've enjoyed this, the after effects, the echoes of Paul's tradition, and look forward to talking with you about these more. Bye for now.